Hello and welcome. My name is Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist based in private practice in Harley Street, central London in the United Kingdom. And I'm delighted to be joined by Sean Young, PhD, who's written a fascinating book. The title of the book is Stick With It, The Science of Lasting Behavior. And this book is basically about the idea that many people, let's for example, say start a diet. We're very good at starting a diet, trying to change, joining that gym, taking another textbook to start revising for the exam, but we're very, very bad at sticking to the actual behavior. And this is a brilliant book entitled Stick With It, which is all about how to actually achieve lasting change and improve your life. So I want to say something about Sean before we get to talking to him directly. Sean Young is a UCLA medical school professor and the founder and executive director of the UCLA Center for Digital Behavior and the University of California Institute for Prediction Technology, which have been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, and Science, and on NPR, Yahoo Finance, TechCrunch, Mashable, CNN, CBS News, and other major media outlets. He has a PhD in psychology and a master's in health sciences research from Stanford University, and he lives in Southern California. So, Sean, many thanks for the book. It's a fantastic book. Let's start off with the fact that you are a scientist, and the book is very soundly based on the science of behavioral change, but you also have implemented your theories in your own life and in a practical business sense. So you don't just talk the talk, you walk the walk. It's a unique combination, your interest in the rigor of the science plus the practical application. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, absolutely. First, thanks for having me here, Raj. Absolutely. So I started doing research in this area. I was in graduate school, and there were personal and professional issues that were getting me to question, why don't people stick with things? Why don't people stick with things? And most of the time, they're things that we ourselves want to do or others want to do, and we want to help them. So why don't people stick with things they want to do? And there were personal and professional reasons why I was looking into that. And as I started exploring that through research, through science, I started realizing that a lot of other people were having a lot of the same questions, and that the answers out there were just not, they weren't solving the problem. So one of the dominant answers out there of why people don't stick with things was to blame it on the individual, to say, like you mentioned the example of wanting to change the way you eat or exercise more. Well, a view is if people decide I'm going to make a New Year's resolution to eat better and they don't, it's because they're lazy or they're not motivated or they lack discipline. That's what we're typically told. And not only does that make people feel badly about themselves to say I'm to be told I lack discipline, I'm not motivated, there's something wrong with me as a person and I need to change who I am. But I found through this research that it's actually not the correct science. Instead of changing the person, what I learned is that we need to change the process. And so just through small tweaks in our lives, we can be able to get ourselves or others to be able to stick with things that we want to do. And so it's backed in science, like you said. We've done research for more than 15 years on this topic. And so I incorporate in Stick With It, not just the science in our research, which is some cutting edge work using technologies, but also decades of research from psychology and in other areas of science on how to stick with things. And I've applied this not just in the medical school where I work at UCLA, not just with research participants, but as you said, in business consulting work and in my own life, I've applied it and find that it's, not just science that's theoretical, but very much interested in the application of this.
So the other thing I think is really interesting about what you focus on, which is kind of you get past the bit where everyone wants to start something, because we're not bad at starting. Everyone started a diet. Everyone started to prepare to do really well in the exam. And I think that a lot of a lot of times that part of our psychology gets exploited by the vast array of terrible self-help books there are out there, which get you to buy the book off the shelf. But people are terrible at follow through. And what's really interesting is your focus on the follow through in terms of how to get people to stick with it, but your incredible optimism. Basically, what you're saying, and you must correct me if I'm wrong, if you follow the program as outlined in the book, behavioral change is almost inevitable. You'll definitely stick to it, as it were. That's a strong sense of optimism I get from you about how much you back your plan.
Yeah. So like you said, self-help books and motivational speakers, they are there because there's a lack of knowledge about the science. So someone decides, I want to be more productive at work, or I want to eat better, I want to exercise more, I want to read more books, whatever it is. The conventional wisdom, again, tells us that if we're not doing it, it's because there's something wrong with us as a person and we're not motivated. So there's been this whole self-help industry, or motivational speakers and gurus, and this whole industry that's come out under the idea of the solution is to make people feel more motivated, get us to start doing things, we haven't done, and that will be the solution. But then for people to stick with it, the assumption is we just need to stay motivated all the time. And the reality is, you can never be motivated 100% of the time. Whether if you want to get yourself to exercise more frequently, I mean, I'm really diligent about exercising, but there are many days where I don't feel like getting out there and exercising. But if you follow a scientific process, then it's not about going and hearing a speaker who's going to motivate you. It's not about reading a book, which is just going to be a temporary feeling. You're going to have what I call forces in place, and we'll get into this in a minute. You'll have forces that are backing you and pushing you to continue that no matter how you're feeling. And then that will ultimately lead you to be more motivated because you'll be following through with things you weren't doing. Now, in terms of the likelihood of it, you're right. I'm very optimistic about this. There's a caveat in there where I don't say you'll be able to achieve any dreams that you have. There's an example I give of musicians. Let's say if your dream is to be a rock star, a famous musician, this isn't a recipe for saying you're going to be famous. It's not a recipe for saying you're going to be the best marathon runner ever. What it is a recipe for saying, if this will help you be able to stick with things better than you're currently doing, because by using these tools and forces, it has been proven to get people to be better at sticking with things. And I can go into the stats and the science behind that in a little bit.
So the book is severely practical, as well as, being grounded in proper rigorous research. And one of the practical things you do is you give people an acronym which will help guide them and help them remember the process they have to be engaged in. And the acronym is SCIENCE. And each letter stands for a different part of the process. So the S bit starts with stepladders: C for community, I for important, E for easy, N for neurohack, C for captivating, and E for ingrained. So let's just pick on a few of those things. Let's go with stepladders to begin with, because I found this a fascinating chapter. So what are stepladders?
Sure. And before I'd even get into that, I would talk about the three different types of behaviors. What I think's unique about Stick With It, because there are so many, there are self-help books, there are behavior change books out there. But what is unique about Stick With It is that behaviors are not all the same. We can't just call behavior. There are different types of behaviors. There are habits, and there's been a lot of, but habits are things that are unconscious, and not all behaviors are unconscious. We're actually, for the majority of what we do, we're conscious, we're aware of what we want to do, we're aware of what we're doing. So the two-step process in Stick With It is, first, figure out what type of behavior you're trying to change. Is it what I call an A, B, or C behavior, an automatic, burning, or common behavior. And we can get into that in a minute. But automatic behaviors are these habits. They're things that happen unconsciously. So first figure out if you're trying to change an A, B, or C behavior, and then use the set of 7 forces for changing those behaviors. And stepladders is one of them. So there's a set of tools that's used for changing behaviors. The reason why it's important is that there's a different set of tools for changing A behaviors than for B behaviors and for C behaviors. And in Stick With It, there's a figure where I show, okay, if you're trying to change an A behavior, here are the types of here are the forces that you need to change it. Here are the tools you need for changing it. If it's a B behavior, there are other ones, and a C behaviors, there are other ones. Collectively, science is the framework for these 7 tools, for your toolkit, your 7 forces. And it helps you to remember science is used as the acronym, not because you need to be a scientist to know them or to know how to use them, but so that you remember this is rooted in decades of scientific research. So now stepladders is the idea of doing things in small incremental steps. And that is intuitive to a lot of people. If you want to be able to get yourself to eat healthier, then do things incrementally. If you want to be able to try to quit smoking, maybe try it incrementally. That makes sense intuitively. But even though people know that, they continue to fail because they're not applying it correctly. Because what does a small step really mean? So I'll give an example. There was someone who I ran into at the market, and he was a cross-country runner. So he ran distance running when he was in high school, when he went to secondary school in the United States here. And so he knew how to run. He had the ingredients for being a distance runner. Then he went into the military, into Army intelligence at the Language Institute, where he was trained as an Arabic linguist. So he was a smart guy, was able to pick up other languages. Then he served the United States Army in Afghanistan, in Army intelligence. So very dedicated, very diligent. And then finished his time, came back to the United States and as a civilian. And after a few years decides, I'm going to run a marathon. And so he had all of the ingredients that we would say are necessary for running a marathon. He had trained when he knew how to do it from running in high school. He had dedication. He had motivation. He was intelligent. And so he decides to run this marathon. And when he gets to mile 19, though, he just collapses and he's not able to finish it. And as I was talking to him, he said, I couldn't finish that marathon, did not enjoy that. I'm probably not going to run another marathon in the future. It just was not a good experience. So what was it that he was missing? He had really all these personality characteristics that we say would be needed. Well, what he was missing is that he didn't actually train for the marathon. So this is something that really resonated with me. I know no way I could be able to run a marathon without training for it. And it's something that would take a good amount of time and training for me to be able to do. But all of us do things like this in our daily lives. These are dumb, you could call it dumb mistakes that all of us do, where we think we can do something, but we just plan something that's bigger and hard to achieve than we realize or think about. So we might not plan to run a marathon, but a common one for a New Year's resolution, someone may say, I'm going to plan to exercise 5 days a week, every week of the year. But when you look back on the previous year, this year we're finishing up, maybe the person exercised once a month for an hour, once a month. So that's not a realistic step. It's not a realistic plan. And so we need to be able to know what are really incremental steps. And in Stick With It, I created this figure called Steps, Goals, and Dreams. And that figure helps us to quantify what are steps, what are goals, and what are dreams. So that a dream is something that takes 3 months or so to accomplish. For me, running a marathon would be a dream. It would take 3 months of training. Goals are things that take about a month to 3 months to achieve. And steps are things that take a week or a day, less than a week to achieve. So if I've never really been a consistent runner, then just getting a pair of running shoes would be a first step. And once we understand how to use steps, goals, and dreams, and we can use this figure, then we know how to plan steps that are the right size to keep us on track so that we don't fail and we're able to stay on course toward our dreams and stick with it.
So one of the things I really liked about your book was the fact that you are giving people tools, but there's a huge amount of creativity people can bring to the tools in terms of how they actually implement the process in terms of the shape of their own lives. So I think, in my opinion, and you must correct me if I'm wrong, there's a kind of sweet spot in terms of what counts as a small step, i.e., small enough that you can do it and succeed, but big enough that it does actually make some difference. Because I imagine that some steps are just way, way too small, perhaps. So it's the sweet spot of most of the time people are picking steps that are too big, and as a result they fail. And you're making the point about the power of small incremental steps accumulating over a long period as being a much more powerful approach than trying to take too massive a big step early on. So any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think it's going to be very personalized in everything in what we do. And this stick with it approach is very personalized. I work in the medical school. I'm at UCLA in family medicine. And just like a doctor will prescribe a medication for something, if you have heart disease or whatever it is, they'll prescribe medication. But that medication, they need to see how it's reacting. Are there adverse events? And you may change the dosage or change the medication. It's similar with a behavioral therapy, a stick with it approach, where it's going to be personalized and it's going to depend, and we will see what works for the person. I'll give an example. I work in technologies and work with technologies, and I have so I get a lot of these step count Fitbits, things like that. I have an Apple Watch, and the watch told me, so you enter your weight, you enter your information, your height, and it'll tell you how many steps, it'll tell you how many calories that you should be burning a day. And it just by default gave me 1,050 calories a day, where, I exercise a lot. And I'm seeing that even on days where I'm exercising an hour and a half a day, it gets up to maybe 700 calories. Well, that can be disconcerting. That can be depressing if you're never achieving the goal that they give you, and so I would call that a dream. And so it really needs to be personalized and created for what's a realistic step, goal, and dream. And in Stick With It, there's actually advice and guidelines of how to figure out what's realistic and keep you on course of that, and also examples from with patients that I've worked with or in consulting that I've done of how people have applied this to their own life so that readers can be able to apply it themselves.
Okay, so let's step forward a little bit into the acronym. So as I mentioned, it's the acronym SCIENCE, S for stepladders we talked about, C for community. I'm going to skip over that because we have limited time, but I for important. I thought this was very interesting because I think you're saying to people, and I'm reading between the lines here, and you must correct me if I got this wrong, which is people have to ask themselves some fundamental questions about what's really important to them before they could just set off and proceed to pursue goals. The goals can't be pursued in isolation to a deeper question about what is important to you, because you're more likely to achieve a goal if it is linked in some way to something that really is important to you. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's no, it's actually the child's toy, which goes off if there's a flash of light. Somehow it's light sensitive and will suddenly go off.
Right.
So yeah, that's motivation. Important is about motivation, and there's a a short list of things and stick with it that are designed in typical motivators. So if things are important to people, like you said, they will be more likely to stick with them. And there are ways to get things to be more important to people. You know, money is a motivator, social connections are a motivator, health is a motivator. So to the extent that you can pair something to one of those things, to the extent that it's aligned with that, it's often more important to a person and more likely to get them to stick with it. So that part of important really, really does matter and really will get people to stick with things. But I think what's really interesting to me about important is that that's usually our default. Usually our assumption is that if something is not important to someone, they will not do it. No doubt, if something is important to someone, they will be more likely to stick with it. But it's an incorrect assumption that if something is not important to them, they won't do it. And you can see that in that there are 7 of these forces in stick with it designed for building lasting change. If important was the only one that mattered, it would just be one. It would just be important. But there are 6 others. And so you skipped over community, but community is an example. You know, in our research, we build online communities, and we've been able to, as an example, we look at how can we get people to get an HIV test. Well, getting an HIV test is something that pretty much no one wants to do. No one says, I really want to get an HIV test. This is something that's really important to me. They know that it's something they should do, but it's not a top priority for most people. So how do you then get people to get an HIV test? How do you get it to be important to them? Well, we found that we've built these online communities where we will engage people and use the force of community to, within 12 weeks, get people to get an HIV test, even though it's not important to them. And by the end of this 12 weeks, it actually becomes important to them. So I think that's something that's really interesting and good for people to know, that yes, stick with it will help people make things important to them if it's not already important. But if it is not important already, then this is something that still can become important to them by using the other forces.
So the next word in the acronym is easy. And again, I thought this was a fascinating chapter, because I think most people have an assumption that, let's say, losing weight or approaching goals is by definition a difficult process. And I thought this chapter on easy was very interesting. So it seemed to me that you were exploiting a well-known but not commonly known amongst the public idea, which is if we change our environment, the environment can help us make a change. So let's take the example of a student who needs to study for an exam, but tends to watch television. If you remove the television from your environment, it's more difficult to watch television, and the textbooks are right by your bed or easily accessible. It's easier to get hold of the textbooks than it is to go and watch the television. You are changing your environment, and your environment is encouraging you and nudging you in the right direction. Your environment is making it easier to perform the correct behavior. So you have to change your environment to make the bad behaviors difficult to perform, and the good or correct behaviors easier to perform. Would that be a fair assessment of what the principle of easy is about?
Easy, yes. Easy is about we often, for a number of reasons, make things really difficult for ourselves. And that's what causes us to fail. And we talk about in Stick With It, we talk about the reasons why people do that. But simply put, if things are easy for us to do, we will continue doing them. And there are, in my own life, I used to go to the gym up on campus at UCLA. And then I stopped going to the gym. I didn't go as frequently. And I'll get into the reason in a second. But if people just saw that I stopped going to the gym, they would say, it's probably because he's lazy or not motivated or doesn't really care to go to the gym anymore. He's gotten older now and won't go. But the reason I stopped going to the gym was that I used to work closer to campus, and then I moved to an office which was about a mile south of campus. And so now it was suddenly an hour, 40 minutes for me to walk up to campus and get there to go to the gym there. So I stopped going as frequently. It was no longer easy. So what I did was I picked a new gym that's right across the street from my work. And now I carry a gym bag with me pretty much everywhere I go. So when I leave work and I'm heading to the parking lot, to the car to go home, I walk past the gym, and it's almost, it's almost easier to go into the gym than to just keep walking, because I've got my bag on me. If I walk past it, I'll feel guilty. And so that's a way of leveraging the force of easy to get ourselves to keep doing things.
So the next word in the acronym is neurohacks. And I thought this was a particularly fascinating chapter because you're drawing a lot here on the science of the fact that we sometimes don't know ourselves as well as we think we do. And there are many little interesting experiments you talk about. The one I want to pick on, maybe this says a lot about me, is the one you described to do with the semi-naked women that the men watch and the heartbeat feedback they get. So just to outline this experiment, men are shown pictures of semi-naked women, slightly dodgy experiment perhaps, may not get past the research committees today, as you pointed out, I think, in the book. And they're given feedback through headphones where they hear their heartbeat. So obviously, if they're looking at a very attractive, physically attractive or desirable woman, their heart might race a bit. Or if they're looking at a woman they don't really fancy, their heart may stay the same. Only they're getting false feedback. In other words, they think they're hearing their heartbeat, but actually the experimenter has rigged the experiment so that their heart is faster in an arbitrary sense. Not necessarily when they're watching pictures that their heart really would race at. Now, what's really interesting about this experiment, having been given false feedback that their heart is racing when they look at certain pictures, when they're interviewed afterwards, they're asked which of these women they found most attractive. They pick the women that are to do with the heart racing. And this applies even weeks later. So they're being tricked into thinking they're attracted to particular women, and that's a neuro hack. Could you say something about that?
Sure. So this is something where it's well, actually, first, so you mentioned, Raj, that this says as a psychologist or as a psychiatrist, what is it about this study that you said says something about you? I'm curious.
Yes, I was particularly drawn to it.
Right. So this study, and this was an interesting study. The idea behind it is that behavior is what leads us. Behavior is what matters. Neurohacks the idea that conventional wisdom tells us that if you want to change something, change starts in the mind. If you want to change something, if you want to, going back to the exercise example or any of these examples, if you want to exercise more, the way to do it is to tell yourself, I'm going to exercise more. I can do this. But with neurohacks, it really shows the science is the opposite. Change doesn't start in the mind. Change starts in changing your behavior, and then your mind will follow. And so the chapter gives different studies like this, which are examples of that the behavior controls the mind. So when people hear their heartbeat, so if you're looking at pictures of in these were heterosexual men looking at pictures of women, and they were manipulated to think they were hearing their own heartbeat. And when their heartbeat was faster or slower, they thought, this is my behavior. This is my heart responding. And so I must like this woman, and that must be why my heart is responding this way. But it was all manipulated. It was all just changing around. So it's an example. There's another one in the chapter of people were split into two groups, and they were told they both listened to an advertisement, and then half were told shake your head up and down, and the other half were told shake your head left to right. And then they were asked, how much do you agree with the advertisement? Well, the group that was told to shake their head up and down were more likely to agree with the advertisement than the group who was told to shake their head left to right. Why is that? They weren't given any information other than a direction to shake their head. Well, by shaking your head up and down, it's like nodding in agreement to something. It's creating the action that you do when you're saying yes. Shaking your head side to side is the action that you do when you're disagreeing with something. And so even though they weren't even aware of what they were doing and they were just told to move their body in a certain way, when we're aware of our body and when we're aware of doing something, it fundamentally changes our psychology. It changes our about the science behind neurohacks, that rather than willing ourselves to change something, rather than just telling ourselves we're capable of doing it, or we have the power to, or believing that we can do it, real change happens from start doing it, and then your mind will see that you're capable of doing it, and that'll help to propel your behavior to continue changing.
So we're running out of time. We're very grateful for the time you managed to give us today. But I want to talk about something, which is the fact that there's millions and millions of self-help books out there about change, and lots of different motivational gurus and lots of different theories. What I think is very powerful about your book is it kind of like outlines, I think, the total universe of what it is you actually need to do in order to change. In other words, my view is there's not something else that's going to be out there that's not here in terms of the principles you've outlined. And if you're trying to understand why you're failing to make a change, it's here. It's in one of these things in the acronym SCIENCE, which is what you need to address. So what I like about this is you've pared it down to brutal simplicity. It's not as if there's going to be something missing from this system. This is the system by which behavioral change is going to occur. I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that you picked up on that. I mean, like I said, I spent so many years doing this research, and even writing the book took a couple of years of time. I poured heart and energy and everything into it, and really wanted to make it that it's accessible and understandable and actionable. And so really appreciate and glad that it resonated with you, and seems like it's achieved that. So yes, it's something where the change is possible. And I think for a lot of people that they don't understand why they're not able to stick with things. They don't understand that. In what I'm going to start doing in the future is creating some workshops based on stick with it. And these workshops will be designed for letting people know, and for diagnosing what are the areas where people are lacking in sticking with things, and then how can we better overcome those areas so that they can use the forces that are needed or that they're missing to help overcome those and get them to stick with things. So I think that's a really good assessment of it, and that's the goal for the next steps with the book, and how to really help make it even more actionable and implementable in people's lives.
But one final point I want to make is that it seems to me that your fundamental view is that personal change, sticking with things, achieving things like running marathons, weight loss, whatever it is you might want to achieve in life, assuming that these are not unrealistic dreams, is fundamentally democratic. We look at people who achieve difficult things through sticking with it. We think they're different from us. We think there's some peculiar aspect of personality they have that which we just don't have, some missing magical ingredient. What you're saying is it's democratic. We can all do it. We just haven't understood the process by which we can all do it. It's all available to us. It's a fundamentally democratic idea that you're banging the drum for, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said toward the beginning, I'm not saying not anyone has the potential to be the best marathon runner. Not anyone has the potential to be a rock star or a famous actor, or not anyone has the potential to be the best in a certain area. There are so many things that factor into that genetics and politics and environment and all these other things. But if we're setting realistic goals, then we all have the ability to stick with it and at least stay on course toward trying to achieve those things. We don't know. Outside factors determine whether we actually will get to the finish line, but we all have the ability to stick with things. And this is the recipe for that. And I think that's what makes me optimistic about the world and optimistic about people. And, I don't think that people are necessarily better than other people. It's just having an understanding, or a lot of people fortunately have an intuitive understanding of this science. And in the book, I give lots of examples of different individuals and different companies that really intuitively have an understanding of how to apply this science. But the point of Stick With It is to make it accessible to everyone so that we all have the ability to apply it.
Well, thank you very much indeed. The title of the book is Stick With It, The Science of Lasting Behavior, by Sean Young, PhD, and published by Penguin Books. Sean, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Raj. And before ending, just one thing I'd like to add on on that last note. I wrote this because I'm interested. I wanted to and want to connect with people. I want to be able to help people. That's why I'm, most likely the same reason why you went into your field, but why I want to be able to help people to stick with things. So I encourage people, and I've done this on previous podcasts, interviews and things, and really excited about the response I've gotten where people do write to me and I hear from readers about both how this has helped them and about things they're struggling with. So please reach out to me. Website is SeanYoungPhD.com. On Twitter, I'm Sean Young PhD. I really enjoy hearing from people, so please don't be shy to reach out to me and say hi and let me know your thoughts.
Great. Thank you very much, Sean. Thank you very much indeed. Bye.
Thanks for having me, Raj.